The Chicago Bears are having the perfect offseason. The Bears were the worst team in football last season and have had a very bad stretch in recent years, but things may be on the way back up. Justin Fields showed a ton of promise in 2022, and the Bears knew that they needed to build around him and help him develop, and that all started with finally getting him a true number one wideout, DJ Moore. The Bears then went on a free agency spending spree and bolstered up the defense in a big way while also bringing in some more weapons for Fields. The Chicago Bears are on the way up, and I recommend buying your stock now before you blink, and the Bears are the kings of the NFC North. The Chicago Bears finished the 2022 season as the worst team in the league. No, that's not necessarily ideal, but luckily that means Chicago got the first overall pick in the 2023 NFL Draft. The Bears already seem to have their quarterback of the future in Justin Fields, even though some believe the Bears may trade Fields and keep the pick to take Bryce Young or another quarterback, but ultimately that wasn't the case, and Chicago decided to trade away that first overall pick to the Carolina Panthers. In return, the Bears got plenty of good picks to load up on players that are much needed and now have 10 picks in the upcoming draft. Chicago got the Panthers first this season, which is 9th overall, a 2024 first, a second this year that was originally the 49ers at 61st overall, and a 2025 second. But that isn't all. The Bears also finally got Justin Fields a wide receiver one, DJ Moore. Chicago inherited the rest of his 3-year, $61.88 million contract that has 2 seasons left on it. Moore has proven that he can be a true number one wideout. Before last season, he had over 1,100 yards for 3 straight years. Now, he's headed to Chicago, who's been very busy this offseason. The Bears had a ton of cap space coming into this offseason, about $98 million to be exact. Chicago had a lot of money to space out and a lot of needs to make sure they were building around their young quarterback. And the Bears delivered big time. The Bears were really on a roll during the first day of legal tampering. Ryan Poles absolutely crushed it. Chicago snagged guard Nate Davis, who has plenty of experience from his time as a starter in Tennessee, for a 3-year, $30 million deal. He wasn't the only former Titan the Bears signed though. Chicago also signed defensive end DeMarcus Walker to a 3-year, $21 million deal. But the real big moves for Chicago came at linebacker. They traded away Roquan Smith during the season last year and ended up saving a ton of cash on him. They then used that cash to go out and get 2 big-time linebackers. Tremaine Edmunds, who inked a 4-year, $72 million deal. He played some seriously good football in his 5 seasons in Buffalo and is a 2-time Pro Bowler as well. The other is TJ Edwards, a 3-year starter in Philly and a key part to their successful defense last season with 99 tackles. They inked him to $19.25 million over 3 years. Some much smaller moves on the defense, but maybe interesting. The Bears signed linebacker Dylan Cole and defensive lineman Andrew Billings, both to 1-year deals. One of the big losses for the Bears offense this offseason was definitely David Montgomery, who's been a staple at the run game for them. The Bears do already have Khalil Herbert, who has shown that he can be a number one back after he was an absolute dog at Virginia Tech. To help bolster up that group, Chicago went out and signed Deontay Foreman to a 1-year deal for just $3 million, which honestly is a great value. They also went out and inked Travis Homer for 2 seasons. He'll likely be a backup of sorts, and the same goes for PJ Walker, who the Bears signed to a 2-year deal. Chicago also went out and signed former Packers tight end Robert Tonyan to a 1-year deal, and I actually think he's a super underrated tight end, but he'll likely be the backup to Cole Kmet. Overall, the Bears have made some great moves this offseason to better their team, but first and foremost, the number one priority in Chicago has to be Justin Fields. The Bears want him to be their franchise quarterback, and that's why Chicago selected him in the first round in 2021. Now, he didn't have a great rookie year. That's just the reality. He only passed for 7 touchdowns, and he threw 10 picks in 10 games. He actually didn't even end up passing for 2,000 yards. But he did show some ability in the run game, rushing for 420 yards and 8 touchdowns. The optics on Fields after 1 year in Chicago were pretty bad, and even last season started rough. But then, all of a sudden, Fields started to ramp up and show some real promise. He even broke Michael Vick's single-game record with 178 rushing yards in Week 9. In that same game, Fields became the first player in league history to rush for 150 yards and pass for 3 touchdowns in the same game. He ultimately finished the season as the 3rd quarterback to ever rush for 1,000 yards in a season, joining Michael Vick and Lamar Jackson. Fields ended up throwing for 2,240 142 yards and 17 touchdowns to 11 interceptions, adding 8 touchdowns rushing. Yeah, it wasn't anything crazy, but for a few weeks there, Justin Fields was legitimately one of the best quarterbacks in the league. I think he showed a ton of promise and the ability that he could eventually become a truly elite quarterback. But there was one big problem last year. He had no good weapons around him. DJ Moore is clearly the new top wide receiver in Chicago, and if I'm being honest, they probably still could use some better weapons, but he really upgrades the wideout room as a whole. Darnell Mooney likely slides into the wide receiver 2 role, where he honestly really belongs. He has been incredibly underrated as a 5th round pick in 2020. I mean, he had over 1,000 yards in 2021, but last season he missed a ton of time with an ankle injury and it just wasn't great. Chicago does also have Chase Claypool. The Bears traded for him last season, giving up their 2nd round pick, and he had a rough time in Chicago, only with 140 yards in 7 games. But maybe he'll have a bigger role this season. The Bears have had a ton of issues on the offensive line, even though it was kind of solidish last year. I think the biggest name has to be Tevin Jenkins, who went from what felt like a solidified bust to playing great at right guard last season. Maybe every other spot could get moved around, but Cody Whitehair and Braxton Jones probably fit in there somewhere. The Bears defense could use help literally everywhere. You might not even know like almost anyone that came into this offseason. At defensive end, Trevis Gibson and Dominique Robinson are important, and at defensive line, it was really just Justin Jones coming into the offseason. Like I said, it's rough. Jack Sanborn was the only linebacker really worthwhile, and it'll be interesting to see how he fits now with Tremaine Edmunds and TJ Edwards on the team. Jalen Johnson is cornerback 1, and he's actually entering his last year of his rookie deal. He'll be alongside Kyler Gordon, who was a rookie last season. Finally, the only real strength on the defense before free agency was safety. Eddie Jackson is a hot name and has been pretty good at times, but he is coming off of a season-ending foot injury. Meanwhile, Jaquan Brisker on the other side had a good rookie season. It'll be interesting to see if the Bears can figure out their defense, but that is ultimately why they hired Matt Eberflus to be their head coach a year ago. I really do believe the Bears are finally back on the right track to becoming a contender. Now, there's probably a few years until that's really the case, but regardless, Chicago is going to be much better this next season than they were last year. Not only did Justin Fields really break out in 2022, but Ryan Poles and the Bears front office have really done their best to surround him with more weapons. But we'll get back to the offense a bit later. As for the Bears' defense, well, the defense was pretty rough last season. They allowed the most points scored by quite a bit, and the Bears knew they needed to fix that. Chicago was pretty middle of the pack when it comes to passing yards allowed. They sat about 18th in the league after last season, which isn't awful, but they definitely left some room for improvement. I think the passing game will probably be the weak point of Chicago's defense next year, but who really knows how that secondary looks if Eddie Jackson can't bounce back to 100%. As for the rushing defense, I think we'll see a drastic improvement from last year. Last season, Chicago ranked 31st in rushing yards allowed by Pro Football Reference, and I anticipate them to bump up that list quite a bit this year. Not only did they bolster that defensive line by adding DeMarcus Walker, but that linebacker room went from just okay to great with the additions of both Tremaine Edmunds and TJ Edwards. I'm really excited to see how this basically new Chicago defense meshes next season, because if all goes well, they could cause some serious issues for opposing offenses. And speaking of offenses, Chicago's just got a lot better, and a lot of that is due to the signing of DJ Moore. Now, I've seen a lot of split opinions on Twitter from Bears fans. Some aren't satisfied with Moore being their #1 wide receiver, and some are thrilled about the addition. And I'll just say this about it. In my opinion, DJ Moore is a true #1. And even if you don't have this crazy big name as your wide receiver 1, you also have some other weapons around Moore that round out to what could be a really solid wide receiver core. Darnell Mooney has shown flashes in his career with over 1,000 yards in 2021. And while, yes, last year was statistically his worst year since coming into the league, I don't anticipate it to stay that way now that Moore is there, especially if he can stay healthy. You also have Chase Claypool, another guy who's shown flashes of being solid. Now, I think Claypool probably bumps down to wide receiver 3 here. I mean, he's a good player, but with Moore and Mooney there, I'm not exactly sure how much usage he actually gets. Now, at tight end, I really like Cole Kmet. I think he can be a really useful weapon for Justin Fields, and he had a solid year last year. So with all these new weapons, it's going to be exciting to see how it all kind of meshes together this season. I feel like I know a ton of Bears fans, and it seems like it's been miserable, outside of maybe that 2018 season with Trubisky and Nagy leading the way. But regardless, I know it's been tough, but at the very least, this new regime in Chicago seems to be serious about fixing the lingering problems there, and I for one can't wait to see how it all shakes out in 2023.